So I do a lot of these webinars, and before COVID, lots of in-person stuff. Obviously, like many people, I prefer the in-person where I can actually see the audience. I'll just have to assume you're laughing at all my jokes and that I'm the funniest guy you've ever met. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that is not particularly funny, and that is shame. And the title of this presentation was very sort of mindfully chosen: the root of disorder, not the root of the disorder. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit of philosophy here, some neuroscience, and hopefully some practical stuff that we get to. I tend to be long-winded, as some of you may be able to relate with. When someone says, "Can you speak for an hour?" I say, "What? That's it?" We can go for 6 hours, so I'll try and get everything in that I need to get in or want to get in. For some reason, there's colorful little yellow marks appearing on my screen. I don't know where those are coming from, but whatever. They're not interfering yet. So yeah, a little bit about myself. I'm a registered clinical counselor. I'm located out in British Columbia in Abbotsford. I have private practice named Connectivity Counseling. I've been in private practice for about 10 years. Prior to that, I worked in a drug and alcohol treatment center, residential center, obviously working with addictions, and but that sort of bled out into lots of different areas. It was through my work there that I attended a workshop by Gabor Mate, who many of you are probably familiar with. Loved what he had to say. So I bought all of his books and started reading them all at the same time, including Scattered Minds, thinking, hey, this might help me understand some of my clients better. And I was about a chapter in when I realized it was my unofficial biography, which was a real revelation. I was 33 years old when I was then diagnosed with ADHD, and it explained a lot, not just the functional challenges that I had in my life, but how I felt about myself, what I thought of myself, despite lots of evidence to the contrary. I was in graduate school at the time and getting all A's and still felt quite stupid as a person. And this started to make more sense the more I learned about ADHD. I also recognized at that point that I have a strong family history of ADHD. I come from a family of 7 kids, 6 of whom I think could reliably be diagnosed with ADHD. My dad is the poster child, right down to the denial. And I have 5 kids myself, all of whom have ADHD. And as they say, when you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. They're all unique, different from each other, with some overlap, obviously. So this is actually a conversation that happened between my 17-year-old daughter and my 13-year-old son. She was going to do a presentation for a class last year. And so she had decided to do hers on whether or not, it wasn't to sort of like philosophically answer the question, is ADHD a blessing or a curse? But she wanted to actually talk to people who have ADHD about their experience. And so we're not trying to overall answer the question. She interviewed 14 people. 7 of them said it was a blessing. 7 said it was a curse. But this is a conversation between my daughter and my son. She said, Luke, for this thing, can you think of a way in which ADHD causes you problems? And Luke sat there for a second. He appeared to be pondering the question. Jill waited for him to answer the question. And Luke, after some pondering, said, sorry, what was the question? Which was a great answer to the question in some ways. I'm sure we can, many of us can relate to that. When I do presentations, I always start with the same 2 slides. This one, EEFB, event. So an event happens, our explanation of that event leads to our feelings about the event, and our feelings often lead to our behavior. I recognize that that is not always the case. Sometimes things go in some different order. But the reason why I put that up there is because I'm hoping that people will have a different explanation for some of the things that they experience And when they have a different explanation, they will then have a different feeling about that thing that has happened and will act differently. Now, I recognize speaking at a CADDAC conference, I am preaching to the choir for the most part, but some of you may be on here to learn about yourselves or your spouse or a parent or a child. And that's why this next slide I find to be important. And that what I refer to as a parallel process is if I'm talking about something and you might think, oh, that explains why, Johnny does this particular thing. What I want people to try and do is find a way that it also applies to them in some way. So when working with parents of ADHD kids or teachers is another common group of people that I'm working with, it will come up like, I don't understand like why we keep having the same conversation. And, even though it worked so badly every time, he still doesn't learn his lesson and so on and so on. And they just can't wrap their mind around someone who, and so I would say, well, is there anything in your life that you continue to do despite knowing it's probably not very good for you? I've yet to meet anyone who could say no to that question. So once that person's recognized, okay, yeah, I guess, I eat too much sugar or I stay up too late or whatever it is, right? So why don't you just stop? Well, it's complicated, right? This is complicated too. And that's not an attempt to shut them down, but it's an attempt to help them relate to this person's experience, even though they may not have ADHD and may not struggle with attention and focus and memory and all those kinds of things. There is some parallel. After all, that is one of the common sort of naysayers criticism. Oh, everyone's like that. Well, no, not everyone's like that. Everyone maybe does some of these things some of the time. But so talking about shame today, this is an important principle. The single greatest tool for growth is acceptance, and the single greatest tool for destruction is shame. This is true not just philosophically, but it's actually true biologically, as we're going to learn. Some of you may know some of this stuff already. That's fine. But we're going to talk about shame and its impact on the developing and nervous system and on the continuing function of the nervous system. We're all familiar, most likely, with these categories, if you will, of ADHD, that we've got hyperactive, primarily hyperactive, impulsive presentation, primarily inattentive, and combined. I would love to see the research behind where we came up with these labels, because I think it's quite common for people to be inattentive and impulsive without being hyperactive. Impulsivity seems to travel all the way up and down the spectrum, whether it's impulsive actions or impulsive decisions or impulsive thoughts even. So we're all familiar with this. These are some of the brain areas that are implicated in ADHD. As humans, we like to believe that we know things, when it's probably more accurate to say that we strongly believe things based on the evidence that we've gathered so far and mutually agree is acceptable as evidence. And so when we do an fMRI scan that shows a certain part of the brain lighting up when doing a certain action, we tend to say that part of the brain is responsible for that action or something like that, when really what we can say is that it's involved in that action, but that activity in a certain brain area is not necessarily causing something. It might also be inhibiting something. So just because a certain part of the brain lights up, as I said, what it might be lighting up is the brakes that it's putting on, not the gas pedal. So these are just some areas, and the more we learn about the brain, the more we learn that we haven't learned very much about the brain. And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time speaking authoritatively about the brain and different brain areas. I'm going to talk about some things that are more closer to the surface, I guess you could say, in terms of complexity with neuroscience. We only have an hour after all. Most of us are familiar with our prefrontal cortex. and how well it works or doesn't work. So if you look at all of the different things that seem to be housed in, influenced by the functioning and activity level of the prefrontal cortex, or PFC, that's a lot. Attention regulation, focus, working memory, inhibition of all kinds, emotion regulation, planning, learning, perspective taking, basically all of the things. When I'm describing to someone what the PFC does, especially if they have ADHD, I'll say, you know, all of the things that you really struggle with, yeah, that's what your PFC is responsible for in some way. It's a very broad way of describing it. The reason why I want to focus on the PFC today, again, it's not the only area, but we want to focus on it because it is such a critical intersection. As the brain develops, and the PFC is the last part to develop, what's supposed to happen is all of those other areas are supposed to develop connections with the PFC as sort of a command center. And when that PFC is either not developed typically, or is not functioning typically, if it's functioning abnormally, it's underactivated or overactivated for that matter, it's going to affect all of these areas. So what I mean by this, what do we see, is a better question than what do we do. This is actually, I don't know if he originated, but I first heard Gordon Neufeld say this in a presentation that he was doing. If those of you familiar with Gordon Neufeld, he's a developmental psychologist from Vancouver, and has written a book called Hold On to Your Kids, about the importance of attachment and what happens when attachment goes sideways. And he says that this combination of questions is what comes up when teachers or parents or spouses or whatever, they have a family member or student with a behavior problem or emotional problem. Well, what do we do about it? He says that where you have to start is, well, what do we see? In other words, it goes back to that EEFB slide. Well, what do you see that is happening? In other words, not just what are you observing, but another way of asking this question is, well, what is your explanation for what you're observing? Because the explanation will lead to the feelings, which lead to the action. So if I'm seeing someone being inattentive while I'm giving a presentation, and my explanation is that it's because the presentation is boring, then I'm going to feel pressure to make the presentation more entertaining. And I feel like I have to go off my script and tell some funny stories, or I might make a lot of eye contact with that person, which I have been known to do, where I'm like, end up just giving this presentation of this one person, trying to get them to crack a smile, or at least nod their head or something. If my explanation is that, you know, they're a jerk, then I might just ignore them and talk to everybody else. If my explanation is not everybody registers emotions on their face, and they may actually be getting a lot, then my feelings and behavior will be different. So that's why it's so important that when we're working with people, and that includes ourselves, we're not exempt from this, that we have accurate, helpful explanations, which aren't always the culturally default explanations. So this slide, what I'm depicting here is that the word dog is an accurate description of what kind of animal we're looking at here. But as you can see, these two animals are in different states. They are different kinds of dogs. And so the word dog, while it's sufficient to describe what kind of animal this is, it's not sufficient to describe what kind of dog this is. Why am I saying that? Because, as I said earlier, when you meet one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. And while there are many things that are highly relatable across the population of people who are experienced with ADHD, not everything is. There's an Instagram account that I highly recommend to everybody, including all of my clients, called ADHD Meme Therapy. And he's a genius at sort of coming up with memes that visually depict the ADHD experience. But he also adds in lots of stuff about social anxiety, and that stuff is not super relatable to me, but the ADHD part is very relatable. So as we're talking today about disorders and illnesses and shame, we want to make sure that we are talking about the same thing, because even though this picture here is very clearly labeled, it is clearly not accurate. And so one thing that we need to make sure is that we share some kind of common language, that we're talking about the same thing. So I'm a bit of a word nerd, you might say. So we're going to be talking a little bit of etymology today, which is not just definitions of words, but the origin of words. Because I believe that a lot of times that the origins of words, the root of these words, carries a lot of weight when it comes to understanding them, even though maybe over time the meaning has slightly changed. So when I'm working with ADHD, and including living with it myself, the differentiation that we saw before, where it's hyperactive and inattentive and combined, I sort of co-opt that into symptoms of ADHD and symptoms because of ADHD. And the result of the combination of those two things is what we call disorder, or to use the DSM language, functional impairment. What I want to talk about is this word disorder. So when we're talking about disorder, if someone has a disorder, generally thinking in negative terms, right? Some of these words are going to pop up. It's a behavior problem. They have a disability. It's a bad thing. There's something wrong with them. This is what we mean by disorder. So we want to break that down a little bit. So let's look at this term mental illness. I was asked to speak at an event at a high school some years ago on breaking the stigma with mental illness. And it was me and another presenter, and the other presenter had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and sort of had created this foundation to help support people, and it was doing amazing things. And I was going to be speaking about sort of similar topic to tonight, about like embracing your abnormality and that kind of stuff. And the MC said, we're honored tonight to have two speakers with us, both of whom have struggled with mental illness. And even though I was about to give a presentation about stigma, my internal reflex was like, what? I don't have mental illness. What are you talking about? And I was like, oh, well, no, actually, I guess in a sense I do. But I think it's the word illness that creates that reflexive reaction. So let's look at some synonyms for illness: sickness, disease. Mental disease is actually a phrase that used to be used to describe mental illness. Now let's break down this word disease, because what if we think of disease not as a sort of germ that we carry or something like that, but a dis-ease. Dis meaning lack of. So if I have a dis-ease, I have a lack of ease. Now we look at synonyms for dis-ease: distress, right? Discomfort, a lack of comfort. So now we're starting to look like a mental illness is a lack of mental comfort. Now let's look at some synonyms for comfort. To console, right? To be with is essentially to console. Con meaning with. We are together, we are connected. To support, to lift up, and to encourage. Now, I particularly like this word encourage. En, the prefix, means to put in or to make something. So like to enable means to make able or to give ability. So to encourage is to give courage. And the original definition, courage, from the French, I know it seems like one word to say all of this, but this is the original meaning: to speak one's mind by telling all one's heart. You can see why that might require what we call courage to do. And a related word then is empower. So to put in or to make or to give the ability to do something, to give strength. So that little word adventure tells us that the opposite of illness is actually empowerment. If I'd led with this slide, you might have gone, yeah, and then gone, wait, what? So if we want to go through that again, right? Illness, meaning dis-ease or a lack of ease, a lack of comfort. To comfort is to console, and so on down, we come down to encourage. So if a person is struggling with what we societally or clinically call a mental illness, what this tells us is that part of the solution, if you want, I'm not saying cure, but solution for helping that individual is empowering that individual. This probably is not a revelation to the people that I'm talking with. A mental illness is also not necessarily synonymous with a mental disorder, because in the DSM, the diagnostic manual, you can have all of these signs and symptoms and meet all these criteria, but there's a criterion at the bottom of each disorder that says, does it cause significant impairment in functioning in social, educational, occupational, or other important areas? So what this means is if I'm a genius artist, independently wealthy, and I can keep my own schedule and I don't have to go to bed when other people want me to, then I may not, and I'm surrounded by like-minded people, I may not actually be experiencing any disorder in my life, despite meeting all of the criteria for a mental illness, except that one. And that is a necessary criterion. And that it's an important thing to remember, that it's a necessary one. It's not like, oh, and does it also do this? No, that has to be there in order for something to be diagnosed as a disorder. So how I view disorder is that the disorder is not what we have when you have ADHD or any other kind of disorder for that matter, but it's what that causes or what that can cause. And even more importantly, we'll talk about in a sec, is how people respond to that, what is caused by their response to, and I would say even our own response to it. So disorder to me is the space between what my actual capacity is and what is expected of me. So if I'm in a class that all of our classwork is done in class, I have adequate support, we move at my pace, there's no disorder, right? There's a perfect fit between what's expected of me and what is my capacity. If I'm like last year with COVID, I don't know what it was like in your part of the country, but here in BC, many schools were on a quarter system. So they had 2 classes for 10 weeks. And that took its toll on many of my ADHD friends, my young friends who were taking classes like a chemistry class. And if they missed a day or two in their class, it was the equivalent of missing 3 days. And so if they started to fall behind, boom, they just felt like they were scrambling the entire quarter to get caught up. I remember one girl telling me she got 56%, but she's convinced that if it was a regular semester, she would have been able to pull off a B because there's more time built in for her to catch up. So what you see in that situation is that the disorder really shows up, except it's not the disorder of her brain or her mind, it's the disorder in that there's a gap, a big gap between what's expected of her and what she's actually has the capacity to do. Now, she has the capability to do chemistry, but she doesn't have the capacity to do chemistry at that pace. So I want to think about this, that this disorder is what defines the gap between expectation and capacity. And the reason why has to do with this slide right here. Because if this gap between expectation and capacity is disorder, that means adaptation needs to happen. Now, the adaptation is the responsibility of both parties. And I'm saying this as somebody with ADHD. I recognize the world does not revolve around me. And so when someone says, well, I just can't do school at that pace, I need it to be slower, I also have to recognize, yeah, but there's a pandemic, and this isn't a menu where you pick off how education is going to be for you. Wouldn't that be wonderful if it was for everybody in the country, not just people with ADHD? But the reality is it's not like that. And so I do have to make some adaptations myself, get some extra support, work harder and longer than I would love to. The institution also has some responsibility to adapt. I remember doing a Pro-D presentation at a high school in Surrey, BC, and on ADHD. And one of the teachers said, yeah, but she put her hand up and said, yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, they have to do the assignment. And I said, but do they? And she said, yeah, they do. And I said, I don't think they do have to do the assignment exactly as you've described. There are ways that it can be modified. She didn't like that answer, but I could see some of her colleagues around her nodding their heads. That's her stuff, you know, it has to be a certain way, but the reality is institutions and individuals need to adapt to reduce that gap between expectation and capacity. Mental differences is probably a healthier way of describing how my brain is different. You know, we have neurodivergent, neurodiverse, these kinds of, we're different. And sometimes people are uncomfortable with that. Can't tell you how many people I've had talking to me who use the word normal and they put it in quotes, air quotes, you know, like normal, as if like normal isn't a thing. Well, guess what? Normal is a thing. It's a statistical measure of the average within a group. There is I mean, it's obviously not a black and white dichotomy, but there is a scale of normal to abnormal. Abnormal just meaning not normal. The problem is not that normal and abnormal exist. The problem is what we've attached to them. And that is normal is right, normal is good, abnormal is not. But of course, there's a double standard, because if I was abnormally rich, I don't think anyone would persecute me for that. They wouldn't say, oh, that poor guy. If I was abnormally tall and handsome, again, I wouldn't be getting an outpouring of sympathy, even though I am statistically abnormal. So when we are abnormal, we are not what the average is, right? If you look at this graph here, that the middle part, that's the normal part. But if you add up these proportions of abnormal, we are actually, if you are in one of those extremes, you're in 1/3 of the population. So yeah, not the majority, but you're not this person who's just like way off all by themselves. And one analogy that I use a lot with ADHD, but I think it applies to other things as well, is that if you've got ADHD, often you feel like you're on the outside looking in, like in this picture here. And we're looking through the window into that group of people in there, the normal people, who, you know, are able to do all the stuff that we struggle with. Oh man, I wish I was in that group. I wish I was part of that group. I'm so alone out here. And if all of us who are looking out that window were to turn around, we would realize that there's millions of people in the same room as us, that we are part of a group. We're just part of a different group than that group. And we wouldn't feel as isolated. But of course, our culture contributes to that by saying, yeah, you're in a group, but it's a group of weirdos and there's something wrong with you and you should try as hard as you can to get into the other group. So that's why I love organizations like CADDAC and CADDRA and CHAD and these kinds of things that are trying to connecting people, like, oh, you too? That's such an empowering thing. Now, the thing to remember when assessing somebody is that a trait is actually just a recurring state. I'm not going to go too far into that, but what that means, of course, for ADHD is, where are we? The status quo for an ADHD individual is inconsistency. It is truly one of the only things we are consistent at, is being inconsistent. And it, in some ways, is held against us. Well, you seem to be able to pay attention when it's something you want to do, right? I think we've probably all experienced or said that at some point, but that's because we are in a state and states fluctuate. so the status quo, how can somebody with the ADHD be both totally impulsive, yet also have a single-minded focus and be obsessive? How can we be shy and inattentive, but also hyperactive? How can we be distractible, yet super hyper-focused? I'm not going to go into the neuroscience of what links them, but they are linked together. We're familiar with these signs and symptoms. These are the required criteria for diagnosis. On diagnosis and assessment, some of you may have heard of Irvin Yalom. He's a well-known psychiatrist, author, existential therapist. And it was sort of a throwaway line in one of his books, but he said, it's much easier to diagnose a patient after 1 visit than after 10 visits because of this whole state trait thing, right? We see someone in a state, we ask that person to describe based on that state their traits. But what if what if the state that they're in doesn't actually give them accurate access to their history of states? Then they just, this is a very fancy way of saying when I'm assessing ADHD in an adult client, it's useful to have the opinion of their spouse, because I might say, do you struggle with finishing projects that you start? No, I wouldn't say so. Ask the spouse. Yeah. What do you mean? Well, there's this, and this. Oh, but those, they're basically done. Okay. So all of this to say, we're going to lead to talk about shame, how we see ourselves. It's important that we see ourselves as more than one-dimensional, right? So if I struggle to forget, or I struggle to be places on time, I'm more than just that thing. Impairment, which is another way of describing these brain areas that are implicated in ADHD, that I have an impaired prefrontal cortex, or an impaired ability to for working memory, or I have an impaired chronesthesia, which is sort of like the ability to mentally time travel and see what's coming and remember how it's linked to what happened before. An impairment does not necessarily lead to a disorder. And we could be even more picky and call an impairment just a difference in a way in which I am less than what is expected of me. It's not some objective measure. But an impairment is not synonymous with disorder, because disorder arises from the interpretation of and reaction to the impairment or the difference. So what that means is that if a person has an impairment and there's an appropriate adaptation, which leads to functional, to function, there's no disorder, right? So impairment and disorder are not the same thing. Of course, they can be lumped in together. It's impairment without appropriate adaptation that leads to the functional problem. So I'm saying these things because it's important, I believe, for people with ADHD to be real about ourselves. The reality is I do have an impairment in my ability to follow through on things. It impairs me in the sense, I have an impairment in the sense that it leads to unfortunate outcomes and complications in my life. I'm not somebody who just jumps on board completely. The ADHD is my superpower, because sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's kryptonite. If it's a superpower, I think it's similar to the strength of the Hulk, especially when he's first the Hulk. If there's some Marvel nerds out there, he has no control over it. He just gets angry and now he's got this super strength, and yeah, he can fight off the villain, but he also destroys half the city in the process. That's kind of the superpower of ADHD that I have. So what goes wrong is not acknowledging I'm not very good at that, right? I'm not very skilled in that area. I really struggle with that, or I suck at that. Let's be straight up. The problem is making the connection that because I'm not very good at that, there's something wrong with me. That's an important leap that we're making. Because I'm not very good at that, there's something wrong with me. So let's talk about shame now that we are halfway through. Shame, this is how I differentiate it, not just me, but guilt can be useful. Guilt is useful. Guilt is you did something wrong, you did something you shouldn't have, you have remorse for it. If we don't have guilt, we're psychopaths, right? We need to have some sort of conscience to guide pro-social behavior. Shame is something different. We need to never say, you should be ashamed. This is, I would go out on a limb and say, never a useful thing to say. Because shame means there's something wrong with you as a person. Shame is not about your behavior, it's about your character. So if someone is, let's say they're a teenager, they impulsively shoplift. Yeah, you know, it's kind of like a normal human instinct to want stuff and to take stuff. If you don't believe me, look at a daycare. They don't walk up and say, can I please borrow that toy? They just grab it, right? So the impulse to do that thing and the lack of impulse control in some way, you know, these are all explainable things. But if I've done that and it's sort of attached to me as a sign of what kind of person I am, then we're talking about shame. And that's where it starts to become harmful. So guilt, I did a bad thing. Shame, I am a bad thing. There's a significant difference there, not just philosophically, but neurophysiologically. There's been a number of studies, and I didn't want to like include a bunch of scientific mumbo jumbo in here, but there's been a bunch of studies that have indicated that inducing sort of a guilt state in a person versus a shame state activates different parts of the brain. And even more so, what the research has shown is that shame interacts with the male brain differently than the female brain. So it is an important distinction. It's not just a linguistic one. So what is shame? This is a dictionary definition: the painful feeling arising from consciousness of something dishonorable done by oneself, or also known as disgrace, the state of being out of favor or exclusion from favor. Now you'll notice I underlined some words here. Painful. Shame is pain. It's not a metaphor. If you've made a big mistake and you feel terrible about it, you feel it. You feel it in your heart. You feel it viscerally. Why have I underlined exclusion? Because historically, both as a species, but also as a person, individual person, the greatest threat to our survival is exclusion. Separation, isolation, abandonment, rejection, alienation. These are all synonyms for exclusion. It's wired into us as a species to fit into the group, because there was a time, and not even that long ago, where if we were excluded from the group, our chances for survival were greatly reduced. And certainly as an individual, when I'm an infant, my chances for survival are all but eliminated if I don't have a healthy attachment figure who's going to take care of me. So when we're younger, separation, abandonment, rejection, these are literal threats to our survival. And that's why an exclusion from favor gives rise to pain. It's a warning sign to us to say, hey, you're falling out of favor with the group. You need to do something to get back in favor with the group. Threats to belonging or exclusion, they are processed by the same parts of our brain that process physical threats that are coming at us, right? So a virtual slap to the face or disrespectful words or actions, our brain processes them the same as if the person came right up and took a swing at us. And they're processed by this network in the brain called the HPA axis. So our amygdala perceives a threat. It sends a message to the hypothalamus, which produces a chemical message that goes to the pituitary gland, which then sends a message to the adrenal glands, which produce stress hormones, epinephrine, adrenaline, cortisol. These lead to our threat response: fight, flight, and freeze. This is stuff you may know already. If not, there's tons of information out there on it. Now, why am I talking about this? Because when we are ashamed, this whole process gets triggered. Even though forgetting my homework isn't going to kill me, my body responds as if it is. And often that looks irrational, especially not just to the other person, but even to ourselves. Like, why am I freaking out about this? Why am I making such a big deal about this? I just, forgot the thing, or I showed up late. Like, well, because doing that thing threatens our position in the group, and having our position in the group threatened is perceived as actual danger by the threat assessing part of our brain. So when those stress hormones are released into our bloodstream, what they do in our body is that they divert blood flow. So the heart pumps harder to get blood away from our trunk, away from our vital organs, and into our limbs, so that we can fight or run away or defend ourselves or something like that. We're all familiar with that. What these stress hormones do in the brain is they divert blood flow from the cortex, so not just the prefrontal cortex, but the whole cortex, including the areas responsible for spatial orientation and movement and language, even sight. That's all part of that cortex. Stress hormones divert blood flow from that part of the brain down into the limbic system, which is, and the brainstem, which is the core of our fight or flight response. So let's back up. So if I feel that my position in a group is threatened, my brain enacts a process that turns off the thinking part of my brain, the thinking, reasoning part of my brain, and dumps all of that blood and energy into the fight or flight or freeze part of my brain. You can see why this might be an issue. Because, as we talked about before, the PFC is so critical in all of these executive functions that if my PFC is undersupplied with blood and oxygen, that means I'm going to struggle with all of those same areas, right? Anybody who's under a high degree of stress is going to struggle with attention regulation, focus, working memory, like all of these things. And this is why it can be challenging sometimes when assessing and working with ADHD to try and figure out, and it's not a line, it's a big blurry gray smudge of where does trauma end and ADHD begin? Because it can be two discrete things, but it can also be an overlap, and often is an overlap. And sometimes that's why when you have somebody who clearly meets all the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, they don't respond well to ADHD medication, because it's not actually ADHD, it's PTSD that looks like ADHD. So what this is a video of, what I'm talking about is, as this process happens, once, twice, 3 times, what happens is there's in neuroscience, the maxim, cells that fire together wire together, which means the more times that this fight or flight part of my brain is triggered, cellular connections are growing that make that triggering process even faster and more automatic. And one of the brain's rules is use it or lose it, which means the more time it's spent reinforcing these connections between our HPA axis and our amygdala and our fight or flight response, it's not developing connections between our PFC and those parts of the brain. Now, the PFC is the part that if I perceived a threat, my amygdala, the amygdala is supposed to check with the PFC and say, hey, I think this might be a problem. What do you think? And the PFC, because it has access to all of the information, including time information, what's happened before, what might happen, it's in a position to say, yeah, I think you're right about that one. Go ahead with the fight or flight. Or no, I think maybe we don't need to worry about that one so much. So if the connection between the other parts of my brain and my PFC is neglected over time, it's not just in that moment that it's not functioning, it becomes chronically under functioning. And so what I'm describing there, this process called long-term potentiation of cells firing and wiring together, So this is an actual video of it happening. This is not an animation. These are neurons. And I just put it on a loop 3 or 4 times just so you can see what's happening. This is sped up, needless to say. The more repetitions of an experience, these brain cells are going to reach out to each other because it makes the communication more efficient. The space between the cells at the beginning, right there, it's more efficient if they're going to be communicating to each other a lot for them actually to move closer together physically. That's the important thing. This is not a metaphor. This is literally happening. Brain cells are changing position. They're growing new arms. They're communicating more efficiently. Now, this is how we learn everything. So there's a part of your brain right now that's reorganizing itself as it sees this video, if it's the first time you've seen the video. Things that I'm saying to you that you have heard or not heard before, they're causing this change in not just the function, but the actual structure of our brain. So now I'm going to give you an example of how shame might get connected into a network. And I'm going to play this. It's just this little animation that I did yesterday that took way more time than it was supposed to, but you might watch it and go, really? That took a lot of time? So I'll just play it for you and then we'll talk about it. It's just a couple seconds long. So what's happened here? I've forgotten something. I forgot that I had an appointment. I forgot I was supposed to call somebody. I forgot my homework. I forgot whatever. So let's say as a child, I've forgotten to, well, I'll give you an example from my own life. I got lower marks in PE in elementary school because I frequently forgot to bring my gym strip. So I'm being penalized in a physical education class for forgetting something, which actually has nothing to do with physical education. But anyway, so I'm getting punished for that, not just with a lower mark, but with the teacher saying, oh, again, I can't believe this. Like, how many times have we talked about this? Or some snide comment or something like that. Now, as he's, oops, it's playing again. As he's punishing me for that, he has singled me out. Right? He's not saying, oh, you guys who forgot, or all of you when you forget. He's saying, Ted, come on, man, get it together. What's your problem? So as he singles me out, the message that's sent to me is that there's something wrong with me, right? He's not saying, hey, we all forget sometimes. He's saying, Ted, you have a problem. You are the problem. You're defective. And because of that, and because I'm being singled out, my brain says, uh-oh, that means I'm being rejected. Because defective people get rejected. And my teacher, this authority figure, is rejecting me. Now, these lines indicate what we saw in the previous video, right? These are actual groups of brain cells that are growing connected to each other. So I'm afraid of being rejected, right? Because exclusion from the group is the #1 human base fear, exclusion from the group. So as a result of that fear, I feel shame. And this is a critical part. What shame is separation anxiety, separation from the group. If I'm a bad person, I will not be part of the group. And it's so wired into our DNA that we have to be part of the group that it triggers a fight or flight response. So I feel ashamed. And then these are some of my options. I can get really angry and say, you know what? Your class is stupid anyway. Or my heart starts beating really hard and I feel just, what is wrong with me? Or I can just shoulders down, or I can shut down while appearing to not shut down. I can just be like, right? Now it looks like I don't care. And so he's probably going to get mad at me for not caring, which leads to more punishing and singling out and so on. And the chain reinforces itself. And at the end, what the red indicates is this shortcut that develops over time, where I don't have to go through all of those experiences for forgetting to lead to the fight or flight response, because this network has been reinforced so many times or in such significant ways that just the act of forgetting itself, regardless of whether anyone has punished me or singled me out or rejected me, none of those things have to happen. I can do this all by myself in my house. If I was supposed to take the garbage out, and then I hear the garbage truck and they're driving away and it's too late and I missed it, I can go into one of these states all by myself without anyone else saying, I can't believe you forgot the garbage, because I've internalized that message over time. And it's because the brain is very efficient, and it says, oh, so if forgetting leads to rejection, and rejection is scary, and the scariness we respond to with fight or flight, why don't we just shorten that chain and respond to forgetting with fight or flight? There we go. Now it's just way more efficient. I don't have to think about, was this an important thing, not an important thing? Just, you know what, always freak out when you forget, always get mad at yourself, always panic. Now, what happens when we are in our fight or flight response? If you think back to that picture of the brain, that fight or flight response triggers stress hormone release. The stress hormone release affects the way blood flows in the brain, pulling it away from the cortex into the limbic system. And the prefrontal cortex that desperately needs the blood, its job is to remember. One of its jobs is to coordinate remembering. So my response to forgetting increases my chances of continuing to forget. And the cycle continues. So this is the gist of what I'm talking about when I say shame is the root of disorder. The separation anxiety that flares up when I am ashamed, either by myself or by others. And it's always going to start with others, but eventually is often internalized. That shame is going to lead to my fight or flight response, which is anger, shutting down, or panicking, right? If I'm angry, I'm probably going to act out in violent ways, either towards myself or others or stuff around me. If I'm shutting down, I'm going to end up depressed. I don't mean singly, I mean chronically, right? If this is my chronic go-to is shutting down, then I'm going to end up being struggling with depression. And if I panic or I freak out in fear as a result of shame, then chronic anxiety or social anxiety or generalized anxiety, these are OCDs, another one that shows up frequently. These presentations lead to problems in these areas, right? So people with ADHD are known to have more problems in the areas that are listed in these boxes, like significantly more. The thing is that everybody is, who goes through this cycle, generally speaking, even neurotypical folks who've gone through these experiences are going to see the same outcomes, whether they're diagnosed with ADHD or not. So if we have a genetic predisposition towards hypersensitivity in our nervous system, and we're interacting with shame on a regular basis, you can see that there's sort of like this exponential synergistic multiplying effect where we are so much more responsive to shame. And we read about things like rejection sensitive dysphoria. This is what we're talking about. Rejection sensitive dysphoria, in my opinion, is just another way of saying really insecure, anxious attachment in our brain. These are some of the typical outcomes of what I'm generously calling a non-nurturing response. You could put /shame. The reason why I've said non-nurturing response is because shame isn't just abuse, verbal abuse. You idiot, I can't believe you did that. Sometimes it's turning away from a person. Okay, well, forget it then. Silent treatment, that kind of stuff. These are typical outcomes of a non-nurturing response. Diminished endorphin response. So our brain craves endorphins. Endorphins are natural pain-killing chemicals in our body. They also are the chemicals of attachment and well-being and love. And so what that means is that we crave attention, and no amount of attention is enough, because we don't respond chemically to that attention the same way as someone who had a nurturing response all the way along. A diminished sense of safety is not just that we feel more stressed. That's down here too, right? We have an increased baseline stress level, but it's that things that ought to feel safe end up feeling dangerous, like positive attention. So sometimes it's not uncommon for people with ADHD to really have a problem with compliments. So there's a part of us that like craves that, but when it comes to us, some people will actually respond full out anger, get really emotional, and not like grateful, happy tears. But I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I'm freaking out like this. Well, because our sense of safety has kind of gotten flipped around. There's less connectivity between our amygdala and PFC. This is a critical one right here, that people who are exposed to a chronically non-nurturing response are more self-centered, but less self-aware. Because to some degree, self-awareness requires an awareness of others and how we are interacting with them, how we are impacting them. The PFC, one of the things it's responsible for is this theory of mind of, as I'm talking and telling this story or making this joke, how does the other person respond? Are they interested? Do they think it's funny? Do they wish I would stop talking? But because I've spent a lot of time in sort of survival mode, I don't actually have a lot of ability to read other people very well. And developmentally, I'm more immature, which means I'm self-centered. Self-centered isn't the same as selfish. Selfish is sort of like, I know you have needs, I just don't care. And self-centered is, I didn't even think about you having needs. So it basically describes all toddlers, right? And it's normal, developmentally normal. But when we're exposed to shame all along the way, we tend to get stuck in that place of self-centeredness. And if we are self-aware, it tends to not be very accurate self-awareness. So I might think I'm self-aware because I always reflect on things that I say in conversations and pick them apart, but I'm not self-aware in the sense that my perception of that is not very objectively accurate. It's not what the other people experienced. As mentioned earlier, and this is probably not news to many of you, people with ADHD are far more likely to struggle with substance abuse problems or other addiction. We have, at one study I read, eight times higher rates of self-harm, 5 times higher rate of suicide. These are significant outcomes. But what I'm trying to say here today is that this is not because of ADHD. This is because of how the world around us responds to how our ADHD shows up. And if the world responded differently, and in doing so taught me to respond differently, we wouldn't be seeing these same outcomes. Counter will is something that we've all experienced. If you know anybody with ADHD or have it yourself, counter will is what I call the don't tell me what to do reflex. And if we look back at some of these problems that can arise, this don't tell me what to do can be found sprinkled throughout. Don't tell me what to do reflex is about I'm tired of other people controlling me. And the problem is that we internalize it, so we're even standing up to ourselves. So that when part of me says, you should probably go to bed so that you have enough sleep so you can function tomorrow, there's a part of me that says, don't tell me what to do. I do what I want. And even though I'm the one saying it, because it's just such a reflex over time. So all of these things that I'm describing, they fit into that category I mentioned at the beginning of symptoms because of ADHD. Now, this chart here depicts when I first started my private practice about 10 years ago. The blue is the number of people. So I had everyone sort of fill out this big paperwork package before I realized, hey, if they fill it out, I have to score it, and that's a lot of work. So I stopped doing it. I had everyone fill out these assessments, including an assessment for ADHD. And people's presenting issue on their intake paperwork, like, why are you here? What do you need help with? just over 5%, about 6% of people had identified themselves ADHD as a concern. What the green bar indicates is, in working with those people, how many of them in their intake paperwork, filling it out, actually met the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. So 6% are seeking help for ADHD, but about 67% actually met the criteria for ADHD. You might think that's pretty high, but if you look at the things that I was specializing in as a therapist at the time, anger, addiction, relationship problems, substance abuse, yeah, this is what people end up seeking help for, not knowing that there's probably a significant component to those problems that's presented by ADHD. Now, this is 10 years ago. And this chart is from a feedback form that I sent out earlier this week. And one of the questions on there was, what was the problem for which you originally sought help? And I'm happy to see that number, 6% of people seeking help for ADHD, has now grown to 42%, I think it is, around 42%. Now, that's in my practice. I specialize in ADHD and other impulse control problems. And so I'm sure this isn't true necessarily at other clinics and with other counselors. Regardless, I'm quite encouraged how many people are now talking about ADHD as a thing and actually seeking help for it. Now, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. I can't diagnose anybody. I can't prescribe medication, but that's not what the counseling side of ADHD treatment is. For me, the counseling side, there's a coaching component, like, well, let's set alarms and that kind of stuff. But for me, the counseling has a lot to do with, guess what? Shame. The messages that have been told to us and that we have taken over and started telling to ourselves over the years. That's what I'm dealing with as a counselor. And I'm dealing a lot with that internal counter will, where a person knows that setting an alarm would greatly increase their chances of success of doing whatever the thing is that they need to remember for tomorrow. But there's a part of them inside says, no, I'll just remember. I don't need an alarm to help me remember. When there's another part of them that says, yes, you do. There's a lot of history. So I spend a lot of time working with that. Where are we here? So if we go back to these presenting symptoms or signs, this is a way that I came up with to depict my own ADHD. So rather than just look at what's your score on the thing, or do you meet the criteria or not, this is just called a radial graph. You can do it in Microsoft Excel. I don't have a patent on it or anything. So I just listed all of the inattentive symptoms on one side and all of the hyperactive impulsive on the other side, and then just filled out the rating scale in Excel and printed it, and you depict it as a graph. And the reason why I like it, because if you look on this side, this is the hyperactive impulsive side here on the left, and this is the inattentive side here on the right. You can see visually, because so many of us are visually oriented, you can see visually where my struggles are primarily. And what I didn't include these slides in this just for lack of time, but I did it for my brother, one of my kids, and even though they all sort of meet the criteria, we all meet the criteria for ADHD, our graphs look very different, but we all meet the criteria. And so I also filled it out, the assessment for me as a kid, and overlaid it with me now. And you can see there's been some significant changes. Some things haven't. If you look at it here, you see that the procrastination, losing stuff, getting distracted, yeah, it's pretty similar to how it was when I was a kid. It might be a little bit less, but probably not enough to score it down. But I've learned over the years about, blurting things out, about waiting my turn, interrupting. I've learned to bounce my foot instead of getting up and walking around. So these things have adapted. Those recurring states that were seen as a trait have actually adapted. I've adapted over time, and I've built a world for myself that is built for me. So I do a minimum of paperwork. Somebody else schedules all my appointments. My lovely wife, long-suffering saint that she is, runs my calendar. I've found ways to adapt, and so that there's less dysfunction or disorder in those areas. So when describing me then, in the terms of the bell curve, I'm all over it, right? There's parts of me that are totally average. There's parts of me that are way above average, and parts of me that are way below average. And so then to describe me as Ted is this, Ted has ADHD, Ted has a learning disability, that's such an inaccurate description of me. So what do we do about this shame? These are some important principles. We go back to that question. What do we do? Well, now if we see it differently, if we understand it differently, what we do typically will be different and more helpful. And so whenever I'm doing professional development with teachers, they love tools. Well, counselors love tools too. I just want some tools we can use. And a recent Pro-D that I did, I took some joy in informing this audience of teachers, you are tools. Luckily, they get my sense of humor and understood what I meant, which is that your presence and your energy is the best tool that there is. It's more than any technique. Principles of understanding are more helpful than technique. The first principle is do no harm, right? The thing that I'm about to say, is it helpful? I might feel like I need to say it, but is it actually going to help? Who you teach is more important than what you're teaching. Now that one seems to be geared for teachers specifically, but you could see that it's also important for parents and for partners, and even to some degree with yourself in the way that you engage in self-talk. How you see yourself is more important than what you teach yourself, how you change your behavior. When we talk about shame is and shaming someone and rejecting, this is a reaction. And so we talked before about a diminished endorphin response, where I'm always craving attention, but no amount of attention is enough. If the attention that is given to me is proactive, it goes much further than reactive attention, even if the reactive attention is positive and I like it. So the simple way I would depict it is, your child brings you a book and says, can you read this to me? You say, sure, that's great. That's great reactive. That's a great response. But it goes even further for you to take the book to the child and say, hey, do you want to read with me? Even if they say no, because it's demonstrating to their brain that you think about them when you don't have to, and that you care about them. I'm not talking about helicopter parenting here. I'm talking about proactive, healthy attention is going to take the place of shame. So if we think back to what happens to the brain developmentally when there's shame or chronic stress or fear from shame, and all of the development that's slowed down and impaired and interfered with as a result of that, if we're replacing shame with acceptance and attachment, that is ameliorated. And that doesn't mean that everyone who gets all of the right love and support right from birth won't also develop ADHD, because it does seem to be its own thing to some degree, but it's greatly reduced. And what would be even more greatly reduced is the disorder that arises from how our brains are. Identify your triggers. So this is as a caregiver and as a partner, but again, it applies to yourself as well. Identifying triggers is really important. This is, again, part of the counseling or therapy component of ADHD treatment. By sharing the load, sometimes that means venting to somebody about how frustrating it is. There was somebody that I worked with who, had some other issues, but in his own home, he wasn't allowed to say, oh, these kids are driving me crazy, even in the privacy of his bedroom with his wife. Oh, you shouldn't say things like that about the kids. But like the reality is there's lots of science that shows that we need to actually emote that stuff out of us. And collaborative problem solving, If any of you are familiar with Ross Greene, who's written a lot of good books, Raising Human Beings, Explosive Child, Lost at School, the collaborative problem solving is really about meeting people where they're at and involving them in the process. It's not in the least bit shame-based, it's strengths-based. When we are adjusting, when we're adapting, it's important to realize we aren't lowering expectations. We are aligning expectations with reality. So one of my daughters had a great teacher, and he noticed that when they had like this math thing where they had to do a certain number of problems in 2 minutes or something. And let's say it was 10 problems. And so she was always getting like 4 out of 10. So he, on his own, without even checking with us, he said, you only have to do 6 problems. And when he changed it to 6, she started getting 6 out of 6 because she wasn't panicking about not being able to get the 10. She wasn't trying to fly through to get all 10. So when she was getting 6 out of 6, what it depicted is she actually does know how to do the math, but that when she's under pressure and experiencing anxiety, the math part of her brain doesn't work as well. Or more importantly, the detail-oriented part of her brain doesn't work as well. So he's aligning that assignment with what her capacity is and determining, oh, she can actually do it. So he's not lowering expectations for her. And I recognize he's a jewel, and I told him so, and he said, yeah, he was her in school. And that's why he became a teacher, so he could help all the next generation of hymns that were coming along. And yeah, he made a huge difference. As I said earlier, it's important to remember that capability is not capacity. So analogously, I've said in the past, if you walked into the gym just as I hit a half-court shot, it would be premature to say, wow, Ted can hit shots from half court. We should expect him to do that and draw up a game plan for me to do that in the game. Because I may have taken 50 shots to get that one in, and I got lucky on that one. So we might see someone sit still, focus, pay attention, remember anything that we normally struggle with, and say, you can do it. But just because the capability is there doesn't mean that the capacity is always there. Sometimes the ability to tie together our abilities when needed, that's a whole other ability that I would call capacity. Words both reflect how we think and affect how we think. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to focus especially on this one here. Should is not helpful. And these are some simple ways we can make some adjustment in our language, both for ourselves and with other people. I've worked really hard over the last number of years to eliminate, for the most part, should and its variations from my vocabulary. You should do this. We can say, it might be a good idea if you do that. One, it's less imperious. You're not commanding the person to do it. But the reason why should to me is such a harmful word is because it implies you know better. You know what to do. And especially if it's should have or shouldn't have, you shouldn't have done that. Well, I suppose if I knew better, I probably would have done better. And so trying to identify shoulds and their variations and getting rid of them is really important. And this is the last thing I'll say, the power of non-absolute language. So if you think back to the criteria that are used to diagnose people with ADHD, anything that describes me in there, so let's say trouble getting motivated, it's not never, it's not always, it's sometimes, often, usually, rarely, frequently. If we start to inject these adverbs and adjectives in front of these descriptors of ourselves and others, it's going to make a shift in our head that I'm not lazy, I'm not tired, I'm not noisy. Sometimes I'm noisy, maybe even usually I'm noisy, but somewhere in there are times where I'm not noisy. And so I'm not all one thing, because the way self-talk works, if I said I'm stupid, or let's say, and I'm trying to overcome that, and I say, I'm not stupid, I think I'm smart. our brain will say, well, what about that stupid thing you did? Well, maybe I'm not smart. But if we say, I'm usually smart, or even sometimes I'm smart, well, what about that dumb thing you did? Yeah, that wasn't one of the times, but that doesn't eliminate all of the other times, right? So we're trying to move away from this absolute way of thinking about ourselves and defining others as well. Again, the single greatest tool for growth is acceptance. I don't just mean personal, metaphysical growth. I mean literally in your brain, because when we are accepted by ourselves and by others, we feel safe. And when we feel safe, our body and our brain are not spending a lot of time in a fight or flight response, which means more blood and energy and nutrients are delivered to our prefrontal cortex, which is the home of self-regulation. That's the growth I'm talking about. And when I'm ashamed, when I'm feeling shame, when I'm being shamed, I'm in a fight or flight state, and the blood is pulled out of my prefrontal cortex into my fight or flight part of my brain. And when that's happening chronically, it affects the development of my brain. And that shame then is the root of the disorder, because as I feel ashamed, these are not pleasant feelings, and I need to escape them in some way. And the escape from those feelings is the disorder that we end up seeing. So that is my presentation for you. I ended pretty much on time. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions now. My moderator is going to throw them to me.
That was excellent, Ted. You generated a lot of conversation in the group. So I was trying to follow, but there was a lot of great ideas and great conversation happening. But basically it all stemmed from those great ideas that you were sharing. There are a few questions, so I'll skip the comments at this second and I'll go to the questions. Let me just try to. So is asking someone, did you take your meds today, when they're acting a bit more visibly ADHD, like talking loudly or quickly, a non-nurturing response?
Well, I would say it depends on your tone, your pre-existing relationship, and the context. So that's a super satisfying answer, I'm sure. But I mean, we've all, if you've got ADHD, did you take your meds today? It can come across very condescending, right? But I had a young client in my office one time, and he was having a real hard time listening to anything. He wasn't hyperactive. He was just kind of in his own world. And I said, did you take your medicine this morning? He's like, oh, no, my dad forgot. I said, oh, okay, well, that would explain things. So the same question in a way, but delivered in two different ways. So that question certainly can be weaponized. But, you know, in the context of a relationship in which maybe that person trusts you, then yeah, that can be a useful question, especially if we go back to this idea of explanation leading to feelings, leading to behavior. Because if I say to them, did you take the medication this morning? Yep. Okay, well, I'm wondering why we're having a hard time. But I'm curious about it, right? As long as I'm curious and bring a tone of curiosity, it's less harmful. Although the person may have a pre-existing history with that question, that even if you are curious, it might not be received well. So I think the relational context is probably the most important thing, along with tone.
That's right. Thank you. Another one is, what assessment scale are you using to get the numbers in the graph that you were showing us?
I was using the CADDAC form.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And the self-assessment rating, adult.
Yeah, the adult
rating
one.
Scale.
Yeah.
We have that, just to let people know, if you want to access that, we have it on our website under adult ADHD assessment section. So you could go find that in there. Thank you. And then also, can you give us info on the approach and or particular modalities you use with your clients around shame?
Well, I start with psychoeducation. So similar to what we're doing here today, teach people how brains work And the critical thing there is to teach them how brains work, not how their brains work, because that can often lead to defensiveness. But hey, this is just how brains interact with the world. This is how brains learn. This is how brains perceive threat, and then leave them to make the connections. Oh, I wonder if that's why I do this. I kind of joke that sometimes I seem to specialize in husbands who don't think counseling is for them, because I'll do presentations like this and do a lot of, based on a lot of science, and their wives will be at the presentation and they'll go home and say, this is a person I think you'd actually listen to. So psychoeducation is a starting point. Dan Siegel's interpersonal neurobiology approach is sort of integral to how I work. So it's attachment trauma, and more recently moving into non-talking approaches. So somatic-based therapies, and most recently, they all tie together. Internal family systems is another model, which is a non-sort of medicalizing way of looking at ADHD, in the sense that, you know, there's different parts of us inside that have good intentions for us, but different ideas about what's good for us. And so maybe and it's kind of in a way tied to Gabor Mate's premise in Scattered Minds, that the tuning out of ADHD is actually the freeze response that has become the baseline. And so when things start to get intense for me, and my nervous system is hypersensitive, that doesn't take much, then my brain's like, oh, let's go somewhere else, because that's easier than dealing with these emotions. So it's sort of a mix of all these different things. I'm the definition of eclectic, I'd say.
Which is often good because you could reach more people that way, right?
Right. Yeah.
A comment I just have to say, and I totally agree, the best presentation, someone mentioned the best presentation they've seen in years. So
thank you.
It was very informative. And somebody else said light bulb moments. And as a parent, I'm a parent of 4 children with ADHD, 4 teens with ADHD, and many light bulb moments. Made me think of how I approach the children and why they're responding how they do now. So many comments, many stories within each other, many supporting comments to each other. If anybody else has another question, please, you know what, I'll even say, if you don't mind, we could possibly even just let them lift up their hand and open their mic, if that's okay.
Sure, that's fine with me.
We have about 5 minutes left if there are more questions, because there are so many comments and great stories. So go ahead, Michelle.
Hi, my name's Michelle. I just really wanted to, I wanted to first say, before I ask my question, Ted, thank you so much. This was so amazing. I have a colleague and a friend of mine also in this presentation, and we were texting and we both said, this is like just a replay of my childhood. And I felt this has been my whole childhood. I work as a coach, an ADHD coach here in Calgary, and shame and counter will are the two most prevalent things that I see in my coaching practice. And I had a question about so that relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. I see a lot of rumination come about, and I believe that it's some of my training had to do with that relationship between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And I'm wondering what role you see between shame and rumination. Hopefully it's not too big of a question for the time we have. And I would also like to say thank you to the facilitator for the opportunity to verbally ask questions, because as a verbal processor, this is how it works best for me. So thank you.
Well, it's easier for me than having to read them. So thank you. Thank you to Ted for allowing me to do it.
Yeah, no worries. So I would say there's 2 ways to answer that question. One is neuroscience, and the other is not so much. The first has to do with a network in the brain that we're learning more about, which is called the default mode network, which was sort of accidentally discovered about 10 years ago. And it's sort of described as where the mind goes when it wanders. And the default mode network has lots of helpful things that it does. One of the things that it does is sort of segregates different brain areas so that they're not all overlapping and talking to each other, talking at the same time. It also is responsible for our sense of self, but not just our sense of self, but our self sort of in relation to what's going on around us. And so the more you learn about the default mode network, the more my brain was just like, oh man, this has to be implicated in ADHD in some way. And it totally is. There's lots of, again, fairly new research coming out about it. So the reason I'm bringing it up is because the rumination and intrusive thoughts has been shown to be very linked to activity in the default mode network. And so one of the things that we try to do is reduce activity in the default mode network to turn off that tendency. And there's lots of paths to do that, ranging from hiking and looking at the beauty of nature, to mindful meditation, to psychedelic assisted therapy, which basically takes the DMN and just turns it off completely, and allows other, it's a whole other presentation, but so that's sort of the neuroscience approach, is that the increase in dopamine is one of the things that's associated with turning down our default mode network and the rumination stuff. And in a way, it's the most accessible, but with ADHD can be difficult. One of the things that is associated with an increase or decrease in the default mode network function is the experience of wonder. Now, how I describe that to teachers is, if you're doing a science experiment in your class, and it's the kind where there's like a big puff of smoke and some flames shooting out, and everyone's like, whoa, if you look in that moment, if you could bottle what's happening in your classroom, everybody likes each other. There's no enemies in that moment. And then as the wonder wears off, the DMN comes back on and we're like, that guy's a loser. And it's just kind of like a natural thing. But in that moment, when that wonder was so overwhelming, whoa, the feeling of interconnectivity is there. And whatever the source of my rumination was, it's totally irrelevant in my life. So the more time we can spend in that place, the better. Now, of course, the challenge with ADHD is because our reward center works differently. I might climb to the top of a mountain with someone else and they are just blown away by it. And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty good, but how about that one over there? So you have to ADHDify everything, of course, you know that as an ADHD coach, and build in some realistic expectations, but it's still a true principle. It just, we might need to work harder at it than the average person would. I'll leave it at that. There's a whole other answer, but I want to leave time for other questions too, if there are any.
Thank you, Ted. There is one more hand raised. Claudia? Claudia, do you want to take your, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
we can.
Again, thank you very much. I mean, I've never heard like such an awesome way how shame is connected in with this and how it's related to my upbringing and all this, and all of a sudden, like, yeah, awesome. But the question was that you had mentioned at some point that shame somehow manifests differently in women and men, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Thank you.
So I'll go to sort of how it manifests observably, not so much in the brain. So it's far more common for women and girls with ADHD to develop OCD than for boys too. Part of it might be biologically based, genetically. I think a lot of it is culturally based. Boys, when faced with imperfection and repeated failure, are far more likely to say, well, screw it then. I don't want to, it's not important to me, whatever. Whereas girls are more likely to double down and just try and do better. And so you're going to see fewer typically angry responses to shame and shaming from girls than you will from boys. And part of the problem with that, I think, that I've seen is that then the anger becomes associated, like almost like it's a symptom of ADHD. Like I worked with families where one of the kids is, you know, got a rage problem and is freaking out and smashing things. And that is seen as like a symptom of his ADHD. But his sister, who, you know, has a stomach ache before school every day while maintaining her A average, is just seen as having an anxiety issue. But one of the reasons she's so anxious is because she has to work 10 times harder to do as well as the person sitting next to her. And so she's not easily identified as having ADHD because she's not freaking out. Or, you know, if I were to suggest to the family, like, you might want to get her assessed for ADHD as well. What? She's not angry at all. Yeah, it's not actually not one of the criteria at all. I would say that's probably the way it shows up most differently, that response. But again, I'm not sure that that's biologically rooted as much as it is culturally acceptable for boys to give up and freak out, and girls just need to do better.
Ted, I thank you very much. It is 5:02 Toronto time, which means what time is it out there for you, Ted?
Just after 2.
Just after 2. The sessions are done. There are more questions coming up. It's up to you, Ted, if you want to continue on, or if you would like to.
I can probably go for about another 10 minutes or so.
Okay. So people who want to stay, just want to mention though, for those who want to disconnect, to remember that our conference starts again tomorrow out in Pacific Standard Time at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time at 12 p.m. And we will be here expecting you. You have the links. So I just wanted to get that out. So what else we have here is, sorry, I'm just going to find that question. So Michelle had a question about fawning, and I've seen it and I've lost it. Michelle, are you still there? Do you want to take your mic off and ask the question, perhaps?
Yes, for sure. Amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask about the fawning trauma response, because I see this with a lot of women with ADHD that probably because of socialization and what you were talking about earlier, that they tend to manifest their trauma response and just really getting very good at fawning over people as a way of dealing with things. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
So again, there's many angles I could come at with that. By fawning over people and being sort of chronically pathologically caregiving, it's self-preservation, right? So if we think about this, sort of how that all connects, if my acceptability to others is critical for my survival, and when that's in question, it creates this fight or flight response, then I must be acceptable to others. And if I feel unacceptable to others because of my inadequacy, then me on my own as a person, I don't qualify for acceptance. But if I can make myself useful, if I can make other people feel good, then that's my ticket sort of in the back door for acceptance, if that makes sense. And that's this whole, cells that fire together, wire together kind of thing, where let's say I have a dad who's angry and he's always frustrated and he's always getting on me about this and that, or maybe not even me, maybe it's my sibling or my mom or whatever. And I bring him his beer after work as he's sitting in his chair. And in that moment, he looks at me and smiles. And that's like the one smile I get every day. My brain is going to connect the dots there and say, oh, doing things for him makes your life better, increases your chances of survival and acceptance. So let's do that again, because the brain is all about efficiency. And so it wants to use the least amount of information possible to make a decision or take an action. So now it's set up a template. So now in other relationships, even though maybe in those relationships, the consequences of not pleasing the other person are fine, they're not threatening or dangerous to us, the brain doesn't even sort of explore the possibility. It just says, oh, you're in a relationship. The only way to survive is to be useful. So go for it. And it just becomes this sort of self-perpetuating loop. But it also leads us more likely into friendships and relationships where the other person takes advantage of that or exploits it, or that the person is, caretakers end up with people who need taking care of, right? Or who demand to be taken care of. It's because it's familiar and the brain is pulled towards things that are familiar, even if those things are unhealthy for us, because at least they're predictable. And if they're predictable, then maybe I know how to navigate them. So I think that's sort of like the psychosocial explanation of it, but there's underlying neurobiology that leads to that connectivity and becoming an automatic reflex, where when someone's in an abusive or exploitative relationship, you might look from the outside and say, like, what? Like, what? Why would you take that? And often people are like, take what? You know, I had a guy that I worked with who's in an abusive relationship marriage for 20 years. And for working with him for about 3 years, he left. And in the third of those 3 years, he said to me in a session one time, unfortunately, I thought he was joking, so I kind of laughed. Initially, he said, you know, I'm starting to think maybe I have some problems. And I laughed. I said, oh, you're serious? What do you mean? He said, well, why would I have stayed? And I was like, yeah, well, that is an interesting question, isn't it? But it's not because you're an idiot, right? That's the thing. So one of the things that I've seen as I've sort of quickly scanned through the comments, when we talk about attachment and we talk about shame, it's one thing to look up the family tree and say, oh, no wonder I got this way. It's dangerous to look down the family tree. And I don't mean don't do it. I just mean work on, I won't say don't, because that's unrealistic expectation. Work on not shaming yourself for shaming others, because shame will not help you change that. Acceptance will. If you say, yeah, I messed up, I didn't know any better. Sometimes I did know better, but I just couldn't help myself. But it's something I'm working on, and we can all heal, and you know, I can repair whatever harm I've done. You have to have that mindset instead of, oh, great, now I wrecked the kids. That is never going to lead to lasting change.
That is wonderful, Ted. It would be just like so great to finish with the question from the person who started the day. So Vivian, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, and this will be the last question answered. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, did you just ask me to ask
Yeah.
a question? Oh, I was just going to put my hand up to make sure the fawning was responded to.
Oh, okay.
And so thank you. You got it.
But I thought, Vivian, you started our day today. You could end it by if you had
I mean, like
say.
just a deep gratitude for being able to stay and listen to all of these things. And just watching the commentary and how people see it, everything is being diagrammed through their lives. And I was the number of times I typed something out and then just deleted it because I'm here to, the chat's great and also a big distraction for me. But I would say, like in reflection about having an undiagnosed dad with ADHD, and how a lot of things that I took, like I love my parents and I had very supportive parents in a lot of ways. And a lot of things that my parents, my dad specifically, did as what I thought was just good parenting, because hey, I've turned out pretty good. And I've taken on his parenting were things that he was doing as like an ADHD, like there's so many connections about his own ADHD responses and the shame cycle that I have, and that some of the things that I do to my children that I think are like, or I used to think were good parenting tactics, because my parents who did a good job raising me did them, are actually sort of perpetuating this cycle. And so you know, I'm like, I am grateful that you ended with talking about like looking at yourself and that shame cycle, because my husband, who was sitting here at that moment, I will regularly shit all over myself for fucking up my kids. Sorry about the language. And then like, oh, I've got to do better. And I've got to like, I got to go and take a book to my son now and go and like, maybe I'll play magic with him this afternoon or whatever. But that having that self-compassion first and being like, you don't, I didn't know what I didn't know.
Right.
And there is no time machine that can take me back there, and encouraging that self-compassion first is probably my favorite thing that you said. So thanks for making sure you got that in.
Thanks.
And just thank you so much to everybody here and who made the conference, because it's been so good.
So on that note, it's not over. Hopefully people will join in tomorrow as well.
Yeah.
But I really want to thank you, Ted. It was wonderful. It was eye-opening for me as a mother of teenagers with ADHD. I could see my whole, every interaction I have with my children going through in this. I have asked Ted if available to provide us with the slides, and I believe he had said yes.
Yeah.
So we're good for that. And once again, truly, truly thank you, Vivian. And if anybody else, if I think it's just you, Vivian, but I thank you for your participation today, and for everybody who stayed on for the whole, like the 3 sessions. Good for you. You'll be, stronger for it, and your family will be too. And we'll see you tomorrow, 9 a.m. Pacific time and 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern Daily Time. Okay, so everybody have a great day, rest of your day, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye, everybody.
I'll just put people.